ICU.
Welcome to ICU. I'm Melanie Price. When the world summarily shut down in 2020, we were all sent home to figure out how to work, live, and play from a distance. Streaming services that provided programming to fill the time previously spent going out benefited greatly. In 1 year, subscriptions rose over 30% and increased to 1 billion subscribers worldwide. On this episode, I talk TV with my favorite viewing partner, my twin sister, Melinda Price, and author and journalist Jeff Yang, who writes the Dow Jones column, that's T-A-O Jones, for the Wall Street Journal.
It's mind-blowing to me when things step out of a niche thing that only people of a certain community are going to get, and then sort of moves into fan culture, and then jumps its way into the mainstream.
Yang and I also discuss his work on Asian American representation in media. It's TV on the radio on this episode of ICU. Welcome to ICU. I'm Melanie Price. I'm joined today by my twin sister, Melinda Price, who is the William L. Matthews Jr. Professor of Law and John and Joan Grimes Professor of Humanities. Since 2018, she has also been director of the Gaines Center for Humanities at the University of Kentucky. She is also author of At the Cross, Race, Religion, and Citizenship in the Politics of the Death Penalty. Probably her most important accomplishment is mother of my nephew. And after that, being my older twin sister. Welcome to the show, Melinda.
Hi, thanks for having me, Melanie.
Today, we're going to talk a little bit about television, which is something we talk about a lot, an extreme amount. We call each other when shows we like have a new season. We do all of those things. Mm-hmm. And I think a good place for us to start is to talk about streaming services, which everybody in our family talks about how many streaming services we actually subscribe to. So how about we start by talking about what services you subscribe to watch TV?
I subscribe to PBS Masterpiece, Acorn, and BritBox, which brings you shows from the UK and Australia. And I subscribe to something called Sundance Now, which also brings me more BBC and Australian shows. And I also subscribe to something called BBC Presents, which seems to basically be a collection of documentaries about the globe and a specific subcategory of documentaries about how terrible Americans are throughout history.
Okay, great. So why do you need so many British documentaries? I mean, so many British subscriptions.
Well, I have to say, before the pandemic, I was already knee-deep in British television. Mm-hmm. And I think in part that there is a quality of language that's present in shows that come out of the UK that can be hard to find in the US. And also it's funny and they're formulaic in the same way that shows from the US can be, but I like the formula. So they do a very good job telling stories, particularly historical stories. I'm a huge interest in the post-World War II, and we very rarely get shows about World War II or that after-war period in the United States. I really wish we did, because so much of how we live now is shaped in that period.
It never fails. Whatever show you watch, it doesn't matter if it was made in 2020, about 2020, or if it was made in 1967, there will be an episode about recovering from World War II in British television. It's so strange to me, but also fascinating.
I think part of it has to do with the amount of the war that happened on British soil. But even if we think about the things that happened on U.S. soil, like how many shows have we had about people who live in post 9/11 America? Right, that use that as a touch point for how you might think about how your world is reshaped or different. But even, the Civil War, which still stands with us, given our current debate about monuments, we rarely talk about the difficult transitions or portray them in television shows. And I think that TV shows coming out of Europe do that very well. So before the pandemic, I was already in that world.
So how did it change afterwards?
So then after I moved into Scandinavia.
Yeah. Oh, good. I have a question about this because one of the places where we disagree on this is that you have a very strong willingness to watch these like Norwegian, Icelandic, Scandinavian shows where people are in small towns finding really bizarre ways to kill each other. And you have to read it. And I don't understand the appeal of this at all.
Well, first, that's not how I would describe it.
How would you describe it?
I'll tell you, like I tell my students, one of the markers of an educated person is the ability to watch movies and films and TV shows with subtitles.
Right.
So I will pass that bit of wisdom on to you.
Hashtag shade, but also keep going.
Well, one thing that's very interesting about it, having grown up in Texas, is that I just watching people maneuver in the snow was fascinating. Like, I just don't understand exactly how they came to develop such sophisticated societies when I think they should all be hunkered down in front of an open flame pretty much 9 months out of the year. So once you get past the simple questions of climate and terrain, I think then it's a different value system. I mean, to some degree, the Scandinavian shows are more reflective of what's happening in the U.S. right now because they're dealing with having huge immigration crisis. So in addition to watching many police procedurals across the globe, I also have watched shows about politics, a lot of shows about politics. So one of my favorites is a show called Borgen about the first female prime minister, I think, of Denmark. But also the closeness, right, that those countries feel because they are caught in a kind of geopolitical battle. So they're very close to Russia and Russian influence. They're hugely impacted by climate change, all those things. I mean, it's basically Texas in knee deep in a tundra.
Okay. So as you talk about that, I actually hear my version of that would be something that you have recently learned to love, and that is shows about Alaska. Is it or is it not true that you have called me at least 20 times in the last 2 weeks to discuss Life Below Zero?
Much more, less to discuss and more to ask questions of curiosity, I would say. You do a lot of the discussion, but one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that when your child is in school, you have a routine. And when the pandemic began, my kid went to bed at 7 o'clock. So pretty much from 8 on, I would be able to watch whatever I wanted. I could also come home and catch up on a TV show in the daytime, like on a Friday. But when your kid is home all day, you have to watch kid-appropriate television. We have to find meeting grounds because I can't watch Minecraft videos on YouTube, nor can I watch Disney ad nauseum. But one of the common grounds we found was actually nature programs and cooking shows. These are the two places that we can watch. And so when I started watching this Life Below Zero, this show set in Alaska, it was really to try to find a common ground with my child who stomped out of the room and said he was not watching anybody in Alaska. Oh, I also subscribe to Disney Plus.
Yes.
And I subscribe to Apple TV. So through Disney Plus, you get National Geographic and through PBS. So we watched a lot of, one of the shows we loved was this show called Expedition.
Sounds terrible.
It's fantastic. It's about a British guy who goes to places humans have never been, which is, we all know is not true because they go there and they find paintings on the walls by indigenous people. But like most people of his ilk, he assumes that he is the first to go. But the fantastic thing is that he frequently has accidents, and kids love when adults make mistakes. So we watched a lot of nature programs and cooking shows because we were also very much sort of bound to the house and thinking of ways to eat. So unlike some people whose children's palate condensed right during the pandemic and they had to suffer with a picky eater, I was actually able to expand my kid's palate. And I think part of it was because he watched so many more shows where people were preparing food. And he also became more active in the preparation of meals. Now, he has backslid to his pre-pandemic norms now that he's back in school.
So have I.
He has no interest in cooking but lots of interest in eating. That's also something you have in common with him.
Right. Yes.
So that's how I got to the Alaska show. And I think it's similar to the Scandinavians, but with less plot, right? So it was like, how and why do people choose to live in places that are so frigidly cold. So you and I went to graduate school in the Midwest.
Right.
And it almost took us down in the beginning. Like we were in urban places, but the cold was almost too much. Like if I think too long about winter in Ann Arbor, it might bring up real tears about that first winter, but that's what we're doing.
Yes. So let me ask you this.
Okay.
You have a child that you've mentioned several times.
I do.
And before the pandemic, life was about sort of limiting screen time.
Yes. So prior to the pandemic, in our house, there were no screens from Monday through Friday. So Friday, he could watch TV or he could play on the iPad. We didn't have a home computer even at the time. It sounds kind of caveman given how much.
Yes, it does.
The number of streaming services I have subscribed to you, but it was really an effort to help expand his attention span, to have him engage in other activities. And also there was no conflict between homework and TV. There is no TV on a school night. There are no screens on a school night. So therefore, you have to do other things to engage yourself. Now, the struggle was really mine because I also was not able to watch TV. And he very quickly was like, Mom, but you're on your phone. So then I had to put my phone down. So all the things except for recipes, because, the internet is very good for cooking. So we had reconfigured it. It was going great. We had been doing it for about 3 years. And we continued it in the first, I would say, 2 months of the pandemic. And we very much limited our TV watching, except for a few hours where we would, again, watch these agreed upon shows, the sort of safe territory of our TV viewing, which were nature programs and cooking shows. Also, HGTV. I forgot to mention that.
If you're just joining us, I'm talking to Melinda Price, who is my twin sister, about changing screen habits and other television issues related to the pandemic. Look, there's another aspect to this screen thing that you and I have both experienced, and that is how in some ways in our homes, we have become television producers ourselves. We used to just go, walk into a classroom or walk into a meeting, and however we showed up, we showed up. But now, as we teach our classes, or at least for the last 18 months or so, we had to teach our classes, we had to hold meetings, we had to do all kinds of programming, basically from our houses. And that meant you had to think about things like controlling the lighting. You had to think about things like whether or not you had on any lipstick, because television screens make you look dull. We had to think about what was behind us, because now instead of watching television, we were the TV show that our students were watching.
Well, I will say first that I categorically reject that I showed up any kind of way. That may have been a mantra, but it was not mine.
Okay, thank you.
One of the things that I know, so I teach in a law school, and I teach a course for the last 15 years that meets 4 days a week every fall. And I learned very quickly that my students pay a lot of attention to me, mostly because a student came up to me once and said, "That's my favorite shirt that you wear in your wardrobe." And I was like, "Ooh,
that's strange."
That's strange, but it was a nice shirt. So I was, happy for the compliment. But one of the things that we have had to do is to think about, I actually think moving into sort of remote learning was easier for us because we had watched so much television.
Right.
So for years, most of the digital sort of meetings that we had been doing had been job interviews. And I had watched so many people do job interviews with baskets of dirty laundry behind them or in poorly lit rooms that I kind of had a sense of what to do. I think one of the more interesting things is what we're doing now, where my classes are being recorded every day automatically in the room I'm in. Mm-hmm. So I'm not in control. And for instance, I forget that the microphone is still on. Now, I haven't said anything, but some of my students might have said things that they regret coming up, or they may have been vulnerable at a post-class situation in a way that I had not imagined. But I'm very much interested in the how of how people make television shows. Not so much the why, because there are tons of good stories, but the how is very interesting. Like you can definitely see the impact of drones right on television and being able to shoot from above, almost to an annoying degree. I'm like, we see it. We don't need this. But you begin to pay attention if you watch enough of these kinds of trends across places. It also helped me to get out of the house. television during the pandemic. So you and I both travel a lot for our work, but we were grounded immediately and have been for the most part. So if you choose the right nature show or you watch the right murder mystery, I have become completely fascinated with Iceland and fully plan to go there at my next possible convenience.
I don't even know what to make of that. But also, we generally both agree that most of these shows that were made during the pandemic where they tried to like make Zoom stories were not great, except for one, which is Staged with David Tennant and Michael Sheen.
The Queen of England does not like limericks.
The Queen of England bloody loves a limerick.
So this show is about two guys who are trying to continue to make practice for a play that they want to put on when the pandemic is over. And famous people sort of show up on their Zoom to talk about it. Why do you think that show was so successful?
I think in part because you have essentially two friends with David Tennant and Michael Sheen. And so they're trying to really understand whether or not each of them is doing well during the pandemic. They're also talking on a more consistent basis by looking at each other, right? They may have been too busy to just stare into each other's homes. It's also deadly funny.
Right.
So it's really, really funny to think about. You know, there were so many things we tried to do to maintain normalcy through Zoom that it didn't really make any sense to keep pushing for that kind of normalcy in that way. But it's really, really funny. So we developed in the Humanities Center, I run our own new show where we learned how to edit it. Well, James and I actually learned how to edit movies on the computer. And so everything they were going through was like really real. How do you communicate energy and interest and enthusiasm through the screen, and as I was trying to do it with my students as well.
And at the same time, there's a wonderful cameo by Sam Jackson, which makes everything funnier, everything.
It's funny. Yeah.
So as we think about sort of wrapping this up, what I'm hoping you'll tell us is give us some things that we should have watched during the pandemic that you thought were excellent, even if it is bizarre Scandinavian murder mysteries.
So this is not a murder mystery, but it is Scandinavian, which is the show Borgen. About the first woman prime minister of Denmark. It's fantastic. One, learn about other political systems. So I really loved Borgen. I'm gonna make a big pitch for, not new, because I think it's in like its 40th season, but American Masters on PBS. I just met and learned about so many people and their lives and how they came to be really famous and well known in this country. Oh, this show called Work in Progress on Showtime it's a show centered around a lesbian woman and how she is dealing with depression and making it through. And the second season actually deals with the pandemic and mental health, probably the best version of that I have seen. I've also gone back to rewatch things like Vera, which is a police show starring Brenda Blethyn, who's a bit of a frumpy coastal police officer in England. I also rewatched Fleabag, which I think is fantastic.
Okay, so people are very polarized on this Fleabag show. What do you like about it? Because, I mean, there's a way you could look at this woman and think she's not great.
No, she's not the best person, but she's an interesting person. So I have always really liked people who were a little bit too much or a little bit flawed. Like if you're probably rolling through the Rolodex of my friends now. And my friends are big personalities.
Right.
Like there's not, of my very close friends, there's not a shrinking violet among them. And so I get her and I get what she's going through. And how do you live with the imperfections? I mean, I think part of what the pandemic did was to force us all to think just a little bit more about who we are and when we come out of this, what are the kinds of connections we want to keep? And frankly, watching TV allows you to try on a few new things. It's right. So I tried on being an outdoors person from watching all these nature shows. So my son and I went camping for the first time in either of our lives.
Oh, good. So tell them about this camping, because it's not just camping. It's how did the camping work?
No, the camping was fantastic. So we went to Cave Run Lake in the Daniel Boone National Forest.
No. Tell them about how the camping got set up and all of that stuff.
I don't know why there's a bit of judgment in your voice. Like actually not a bit, but a strong
Please
amount.
Please share. So
there's a company here in Lexington called the Kentucky Camp Company. And they set up everything for you. You just pay them some money. They set up the tent. They set up a camp stove. They give you a cooler.
So you watched outdoor shows, and then you found a company where they would do everything, and you just drive up to the campsite and be there.
What is very clear from these outdoor shows is just to the left of what we're watching is a whole crew of people who are set up, I'm sure, with very nice tents.
Okay, that's absolutely true. I'll give you that.
We slept in the woods, and as my kid said, this was really great. The only low point was sleeping outdoors. So we're gonna try it again in May for 2 days to see if maybe we just didn't stay long enough to acclimate.
This is ICU, and I am Melanie Price. We'll be back. Welcome back to ICU. I'm Melanie Price. I'm joined by my older twin sister, Melinda Price. Thanks again for doing this with me, sis. Both of us watch a considerable amount of trash TV. That is, things that people would be otherwise embarrassed to watch. I'm going to admit that mine is Married at First Sight.
8 weeks ago, the experts chose 10 singles in Houston, Texas, to be married at first sight.
And so tell me a little bit about some television you watch that people would be like, you have a whole PhD and I'm embarrassed to know you watch this.
I don't know why they would be embarrassed because I actually have no shame about it. So I really love Keeping Up with the Kardashians.
No.
Yeah, I really do.
I don't think I knew this.
It's a morality play set around makeup and unemployment. And so what's great about the Kardashians, though, is that they actually have very good family values. It's just their other values that are in question. You know, they stand up for each other, they get together, they love each other, they support each other, they challenge you when you're making mistakes. But, you know, how they respond to the world may be in question. But I love Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I think trash TV is one of the worst categories that has been defined about TV because there are many ways that people be like, you know, nature is terrible. That's trash, right? Like everyone has their own sense of what constitutes trash TV. But if you want to talk about unscripted television, and, you know, I found on Instagram Tabitha Brown during the pandemic. I learned to love that Michael Simon.
Mac and cheese on the grill. I have a quart of heavy cream. A little bit of
who was on TV, but I never watched him before because I was very much interested in cooking and how to engage my family. I forgot to also mention Korean shows. One of my favorite shows is a show called Navilera about a young male ballerina who is compelled to teach a man in his late 70s ballet who had always dreamed of being a ballet dancer, but his parents told him it was not for boys. So late in his life, he begins to take lessons just as he's on the brink of losing his memory to Alzheimer's. Oh my God, I could weep now just talking about it. That's the great thing I have to say about Netflix is that it's so global now that you can get all the stereotypes and unwanted images that you could get of people, but you also can learn and spend time in the homes of people from all over the world thinking about what they eat and how they organize themselves in a really beautiful and potentially expansive way.
So here's the thing that I think people always find sort of interesting about us. And that is, so we'll be like, I love American Masters on PBS. And also I love The Real Housewives of Atlanta. And people act like there is a separation between the kinds of TV that certain people can watch. Like you can't watch Downton Abbey and I don't know, I'm trying to think of a show that what people would see as the opposite of that. But you can't watch Downton Abbey and
the show you like, the Married at First Sight. Like these aren't the
Yeah, you can't watch Downton Abbey and Married at First Sight. But in fact, all of these streaming services have sort of democratized television, and you can watch whatever you want from wherever you want, whenever you want.
I don't know why I keep rejecting things on this show, but while I'm on a roll,
yes,
I reject this sort of distinction between high and low culture,
right,
in every form, and that includes television. So we were raised in a working class family in Houston, and our mother took us to theater and art museums, and we saw stage plays at church, and we watched a lot of television. Like, everything can be consumed by people if you make it available and welcoming for them. So I would say there are very few things. No, actually, there's nothing I watched that I wouldn't tell other people that this is something I have watched before, because if I'm into it, then I really like it. So, this show called on
we could
Apple,
do this all day. Keep going. Yes.
On Apple TV, where these people are trying to have a baby. I forget what it's called. It's fantastic about people trying to deal with infertility and work around the adoption system. The Kardashians are...
Don't mention the Kardashians again. I'm so ashamed of this. Like, I swear to God, you have never told me that you watch the Kardashians, ever. Mm-hmm. How is that possible that on the radio, that's the place that you decide to mention that the Kardashians is something you actually watch?
First of all, there's a lot of judgment in your tone. And second, I already told you that these people actually have very strong family values. And I can see similar values in their family to our very large extended family in the way we care for each other. But we also challenge each other to be better and to grow stronger. They don't have the same commitment to education, but they have a different kind of hustle. So I could go on and on about these Kardashians.
See, I see that, and all I see is Brazilian butt lifts and cosmetic surgery and
that too.
Rappers.
That too. But I think you're judging them in the same way you just said people shouldn't judge what television people watch, right? I mean, I don't think there's any distinction between, knowing how to put on a lace front wig properly, which I watched 20 minutes of videos in a rabbit hole the other day in between classes. Something I will never do, but there's no distinction between knowing how to do that and knowing how to write an article for a peer-reviewed journal. If that's your thing, if it drives you and it motivates you, that's one of the things I love about streaming and the sort of lowly produced shows that come on the internet, is that there are people who clearly have found their passion project, telling people how to put on a lace front wig properly.
But
and that kind of energy and enthusiasm is very hard to condemn in any kind of way. I also watched a show where people competed to be the top makeup artists in Britain, and it has changed my eyeshadow life.
Please don't. I'm sorry. Other people are listening to this.
For the good.
I don't know if you forgot about that, but this is like, other people are listening to this, and you are like, I watch a show that changed my eyeshadow.
For the good. But that was a straight line from the Great British Baking Show to something called the Great Pottery Throwdown, where people make pots competitively, to another British show about makeup. It was a straight line on a weekend when I had nothing to do but avoid getting sick.
So this kind of reminds me also of A. Mary, who watches a lot of Nigerian television on YouTube. And she watches like movies that are 5 and 6 hours long and will, like, with no shame tell you, oh, my favorite Nigerian actress is, and then she'll offer up some name that you've never heard of. And I am like, how in the world does a 76-year-old woman raised in Jim Crow, Texas, find her life by watching very long, overly long, and very not well-produced Nigerian movies?
Hands down, one of my favorite actresses of all time, Marta Dusseldorf, who is an Australian actress who played in a show called Janie King. I have watched everything that she has made available on television.
So that's...
But the interesting thing is, I watch television the same way I read books. So if I read a book that I love, I will read every book written by that person.
Right.
Until I read a book that I don't like. And I do the same thing. Oh, this actor is really good. Let me watch everything that's available until I hit something that I was like, oh, that's not good. I spent about 3 weeks in the pandemic watching shows about children in the Philippines whose mothers were in the United States.
Can I actually admit something
Sure.
to you?
I don't care.
And that is,
I don't judge you the way you have judged me throughout this interview that you have requested from me. But let's go ahead.
and that is Nicola Walker, who we both love, who's a British actress. I follow her on Instagram, and she posted something the other day, and I did something I almost never do, which is I commented on Nicola Walker's Instagram about how wonderful I think she is and how I've literally tried to find everything available on every streaming service that she has done. And I literally don't comment on my own family's Instagram pictures. And I thought to myself, what is wrong with you? What is wrong?
She had on a show recently on PBS, The Unforgotten, and
Yes.
I shed tears. I was like, I know she's still alive. But then I remember she was in a great show about divorce called The Split,
Yes.
which is coming for a third season.
Yeah, I mean, TV is a very sort of personal and interesting thing, and I think if you open your mind up to it, then you can find, like, I almost never have nothing to watch because I'm almost willing to watch anything. And I think that helped during the pandemic. Like, people who are very choosy about the kinds of things that they watch and who are very choosy about sort of what things are considered good and bad, they probably ran into a lot of obstacles during the pandemic because you actually can run out of any of those things individually.
I don't understand how these people were considering themselves so choosy, because it's something, one of the few things I have never watched. But it was eating up my social media feed.
Oh, the Tiger King or the
Tiger, I was about to say the Lion King, the Tiger King. And I was like, people who normally, people often ask me to suggest shows for them, which I happily do. You tell me what you like, and I will give you at least 3 solid suggestions in that category. And here they are, these people who were like rejecting shows I have been giving them on a silver platter, watching the
Is
Tiger
it called the Tiger King?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
You know, people are nuts, man.
Joe Exotica.
Yes.
That's his name.
Yes, and I think these Instagram pictures and TikToks of people trying to trap alligators in their trash cans, all of that is a residual of that.
I have one more confession.
Yes, go ahead.
Of my new watching during the pandemic. Facebook clips. The watch factor on Facebook. That's where I saw that's why I went down the rabbit hole with the lace front wigs.
No, it is true. I watched a transgender, like a person who does like the ballroom stuff. I watched a person for 2 hours get ready to go to one of those, sitting on the floor in front of a living room in the front of a mirror in their very messy room. And I watched it for 2 hours with no shame. It was like one of the best things ever, and was commenting like, how do you use 5 different kinds of
how do you keep track of it,
foundation?
or how do you know which number of foundations have? So there's this guy, Patrick Starr, who I love. I watch a lot of Trini Woodhouse, who used to host that show, What Not to Wear, who's like me social media darling. I watch something called Gogglebox, which is where you British people are filmed watching British TV. And I watch them comment about TV. But as we know, it's very much within the African-American culture to shout back at the screen.
Right.
I appreciate it. I miss it about going to the movie theater. So it's exactly the same concept in any kind in those ways. So I have now so many outlets with which to view people's creative product. That's what I would call it.
Okay.
Their creative product.
It's very generous.
Yeah, because these people are, I couldn't do that dance on TikTok, nor would I try. But you did, and look at your success. Or you did and you failed. Failure also is entertaining when people have a good attitude about it.
Have you seen this thing where I saw a headline that said new TikTok trend, kids stealing stuff from school?
Oh, this is happening at James's school.
Okay.
Somebody stole all of the hand soap. So then they mounted the hand soap.
We're in a pandemic.
Yeah, this was like a couple months ago. That's what I said. And they mounted the hand soap dispensers outside of the bathroom. But then I kept saying the water is inside, and soap and water go together.
All right.
So then I just put some more hand sanitizer in his backpack and was like, please use this generously throughout the day.
Yeah, that sounds terrible. But anyway, I also would watch it on TikTok. I mean, it's a thing. You shouldn't do it, but I would watch it. All right. So Melinda Price is a sister of Melanie Price. That's me, guest host of ICU, and classmate of Eddie Robinson, regular host of ICU, and very accomplished in her own right. Thank you so much for doing this with me. I hope people found it as interesting as we find ourselves.
We'll see. And also congratulations to Eddie on the new addition to his family. I could not be happier for him and his success with this show.
Great.
And his temporary stand-in is not bad either.
Thank you. When we come back, we talk TV with someone who is way more of an expert than either of us. Jeff Yang when ICU returns. Welcome back to ICU. I'm Melanie Price, and I'm joined by writer and author Jeff Yang. Yang is a CNN columnist and co-host of the podcast They Call Us Bruce. He's also author of the forthcoming book, Rise, A Pop History of Asian America from the 90s Till Now. Thank you for joining us, Jeff.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm very excited to talk to somebody who's an expert. You don't know this, but in the previous segment, I talked to my favorite viewing partner, which is my twin sister. And neither of us are experts. She's a law professor and I'm a political science professor. So we have no expert in how TV is made. But never fear, we are two people who find ourselves sounding like experts or pretending to be experts on just about anything. But you, in fact, have written books on the subject. Yes. Oh, I also forgot to mention, fun fact, Jeff is also father to Hudson Yang, one of the lead actors from the ABC series Fresh Off the Boat. Which yes. I also love as well.
Yes. Speaking of speaking to people and feeling as if your expertise is questionable, yes. Every single time I talk about anything related to Asian Americans on TV, I'm sort of like, on the one hand, I've seen it. On the other hand, it's full of all these subjective feelings for me. Very, very different when you see your own kid on screen than it is kind of seeing it at a distance by proxy. I know full well kind of how the sausage is made. And it's not easy. And I absolutely am far less critical these days of how people manage to actually make television happen, knowing how challenging it is.
Is part of that because the thought of people critiquing your kid in the show that he's on is too much given the way that you have critiqued other people's shows?
Well, so absolutely. And there's actually a little story to that because back in the 1990s, as a television critic, one of the few Asian American TV critics in the nation at the time, I was asked to do a review, my first big feature review on a television show, a groundbreaking television show called All American Girl, right? Which starred Margaret Cho, was all about her crazy family. And, it was called All American Girl. So, it's like back in that day, you kind of had to really reinforce the idea that these people on screen, they're Americans, guys, no matter how they look, right? So I knew Margaret. I mean, I was friends with her, and I was rooting for the show because we had never had anything like that on TV before, really, and not at least in several decades. And so I told my editor I felt a little bit too close to the show to be responsible in writing about it. And he basically said to me, you have a choice. You do your job, or you can be pals with celebrities. You can't really do both, right? And that kind of galvanized me, and I ended up writing a review that I, in retrospect, was harsh. I mean, not just in its criticism, but in its tone. And the show ended up getting canceled after 19 episodes. From that point on, and for what it's worth, Margaret absolutely, reached out to me as soon as it ran and said, that this show is so vulnerable to this kind of criticism that if this show gets canceled, they're going to take this review, throw it on the table and say, even your own community doesn't support it. We can't keep it going, right? So This is all just preamble to the fact that I, to this day, still kind of in the middle of the night think to myself, how different would have things been if I had been able to if I had given All American Girl the kind of, sort of measured treatment that I think a lot of people do to shows that don't feature people of color.
The thing is that's so great about Fresh Off the Boat for me is I love what Netflix now calls the strong woman lead. Right?
Yes.
I love the strong woman lead, right? Anything they suggest in that, I'm probably going to watch. And the women in that show are so antithetical to many of the stereotypes of Asian American and Asian women, period, that you see on television. They are feisty, they fight, they are petty, they are all the things that make characters really flawed and lovely. And so in some ways, I would imagine that getting that part through is what was some of the challenge.
It was. And I think part of it is when you represent people of color or people of any, again, underrepresented group on screen, there always is that temptation and maybe even pressure from the outside to curve fit to stereotypes, right? It's like, well, can you make them more blank, right? If it's a black character, a black woman character, let's say, shouldn't she be more sassy? If it's an Asian, female character, it's like, we like the fact that she's strong, but shouldn't she be also maybe more seductive or exotic or whatever? And, the accents. Can we actually amp up the accents a little bit? Because they don't sound Asian to me, right? That's the kind of thing that I think has taken a long time for Hollywood to really begin to confront. And I feel, and this sort of speaks to the topic of our show, I feel like it really has only been in the last couple of years where we have seen not just more authentic depictions of quote-unquote Asians or quote-unquote black people or LGBTQ people, etc., as if there's only one kind of depiction that you can have, right? But rather a full spectrum of images and depictions that allow people to live and breathe in ways that aren't forced to conform to a single type because it's so obvious that they're so different from those types. And yeah, in some ways, Fresh Off the Boat was a jumping off point, at least for Asian Americans, for that to happen.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we all have to consider is the ways in which, for some people, but particularly for people of color, being able to have a diversity of images is always the goal, right? That is to know that Vietnamese people are in fact very different from Korean people. And to know that outside of this country, it turns out that Korean and Japanese people and Chinese people have actual beefs that are geopolitical. And so just because we lump them together here, it doesn't mean that they're lumping themselves together in this same way, right? It's like we think about them as they all came here and joined some Asian American soup. But really, there might be real reasons why we want to know the difference between these. I grew up here in Houston, and, we have a very strong Southeast Asian community. And in particular, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian were some of the first ones to come. And so many people would just call them Chinese because it's the Asian that they knew. I guess I don't even remember anybody ever mentioning Koreans, actually, when I was growing up. But it's the thing that they knew. But I think it also is an opportunity in the last few years, even in this city, for people to know, hey, look at the difference in all of these Asian American communities that we have here. In the same way that we're like, there's a huge Nigerian population here. They're not the same as African Americans who were descendants of enslaved people. Yeah. And being able to see that in some ways also, I think, makes it more interesting and more fun. And the first thing that comes to my mind that does a really good job of that is Ugly Delicious, which is really about food, but also about the Asian diaspora, if you will, about the ways in which it's different.
So true. I think that in a lot of ways, and this is in part because of how the diaspora occurred for many Asian groups, right? The first jobs, the first industries that Asian immigrants often were able to participate in were food industries, right? Restaurants and the like. This is just, when you come to a country and don't necessarily have language skills or relationships, a lot of people in many immigrant groups, and that includes Chinese, that includes Koreans, that includes even later arrivals from Southeast Asia after like the 70s, the people who actually brought them over, in many cases, are friends or relatives who have businesses, and a lot of those businesses are restaurants. They come, they work at those restaurants, they learn the skills, and go off and open their own. So there's a sense in which the foodways and the path of food industry culture and how it's spread across America absolutely matches up with the spread of Asian diasporas, which means, of course, that in a lot of ways, food ends up being almost like a proxy for us, right? People, I've like stood in elevators, like, and when people come in, like for whatever reason, they're like, hey, let's get Chinese for lunch. Just like my presence reminds them. It's like, I feel like eating some Chinese food. I don't hate, it's like, that's all good. But there's absolutely a sense in which that mapping occurs, which actually also calls out how a lot of these food shows bring people together. And let's even step beyond food. Like every single time we actually look at especially stuff that catches on in a big wave, right? And I think a lot of it these days actually comes from Korea, right? Mm-hmm. Let's talk about, for instance, Squid Game.
Yes.
It's mind-blowing to me when things step out of, oh, this is a niche thing that only people of a certain community are going to get or be interested in, and then sort of moves into fan culture and subculture, and then jumps its way into the mainstream. And all of a sudden they're on Jimmy Kimmel and stuff like that, right? There are such differences in how people talk about things, how people think about things. And in a lot of cases, it reveals these blank spaces in people's experiences in very dramatic fashion. And I love the fact that people are watching Squid Game. I love the fact that people love BTS. But I can't, for the life of me, when I hear people pronounce certain names or when I hear people talk about certain things, it's like, full body cringe. Yeah.
If you're just joining ICU, I'm talking to CNN columnist Jeff Yang, who's also co-host of the podcast They Call Us Bruce. So let's talk about, so you say the last couple of years have been really, I think, critical in terms of sort of representation in spaces. How much of that would be attributed to these global streaming services?
I think a lot, actually, in the sense that the appetite for content has gotten so huge just because there's so many competitors, right? Every single one of these streaming services doesn't just have to actually fill out a calendar of programming, much as linear services used to have to do. They actually have to have a huge backlog because people click and then click again. They binge again. They're constantly needing to refuel, if you will, on the content. And what that has meant, I think, is a lot of these streaming services have started to turn to other cultures and other stories and other communities that otherwise I think they might not have, simply because there wasn't quite as much of an urgent need for quote-unquote content. At the same time, it's hard to sort of tell what's going to bubble up to the top. I don't think anybody believed that Squid Game was going to be one of the, if not the most popular shows on Netflix in history, right? It's a show about Korean people playing childhood games to the death, essentially. And wow, how did that end up becoming, kind of the pop culture moment?
And what does it say about where we are in the globe, where we're like, what I want to watch? People play patty cakes and die.
Well, so that speaks to the other thing, right? Which yes. I think it's the fact that we have spent so much time trapped in our homes by the pandemic. So many things we used to do and take for granted outdoors aren't available to us, including going to movie theaters, right? This is such a big moment for television and for, I think, especially streaming TV, because we're not at home just during prime time anymore. We're at home round the clock. People are clicking on Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus or whatever, and they're watching stuff throughout the day. And what that means is there's more bandwidth for sampling, more idle clicking onto stuff that looks interesting. And so I do think that makes a big difference. I think it has opened up the aperture for a lot of Americans who I think historically might have been governed primarily by familiarity. But at the same time, each generation changes. And I do think that what we've seen is, especially with Gen Z, a generation that has really grown up with a very different set of compasses. They're not like, oh, I want to look at the thing that I already know, and then a thing that's almost exactly the same as that other thing that I just already knew about. They're more eager to try and sample novel things, to stray across boundaries, to fluidly shape the way they consume stuff than any other, I think, generation in history.
So let's talk about specifics. You know, you have these shows that are doing the same thing that Hollywood is wont to do, which is we saw a success. Let's figure out how many ways we can replicate that a million times.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you would like to see. If you were pitching kind of ideas and shows, what kinds of things would you like to see?
Wow, that's...
The critic becomes the producer.
So I will say this. There are things that feel like are very much still a gap. Stories that are a little bit more intersecting, right? Stories that aren't just about individual cultures, but about how worlds collide and combine. Honestly, one place where I think we're going to hopefully see a lot more about is families that are Black and Asian. Right? I mean, we live in a world where Naomi Osaka, for instance, is one of the greatest tennis players in the world, and where the very notion the vice president of the United States is Indian and Black, right?
Right.
And all American. So we're finally in a place where I think people are starting to acknowledge multiracial and multicultural identities in a very different way, less about single boxes and more about the spectrum of experiences. The other thing I actually, on the other end of the spectrum, would like to see more of is epic fantasy that features people of color. And I say this because so much of our experience of fantasy storytelling in general is based on European ideas of what...
They all have British accents.
Oh my
no
gosh,
matter
yeah.
where the fantasy is. Yes.
And blonde hair, blue eyes, fair skin, like all those things are coded into the very way we tell fairy tales in a lot of ways, at least in this country and in the West. And there are so many incredible stories, I think, that can come out of other cultures' depictions of fantasy that still have not really made it to the screen as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you so much for joining me. Jeff Yang is CNN columnist and co-host of the podcast They Call Us Bruce. You should also look for his forthcoming book, Rise, A Pop History of Asian America from the 90s Till Now. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Melody. This has been a lot of fun. Anytime you need me.
ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Our show team includes technical director Todd Hulslander, producers and editors Matthew Bura, Mark DeClaudio, and Laura Burks, and sound designer Dave McDermott. You can also hear our episodes online and subscribe to the podcast at icushow.org. I'm Melanie Price, filling in for Eddie Robinson. Thank you so much for listening.